In 1884 Arizona Territory, Elena Vasquez, a young Mexican-American woman, faces public punishment for allegedly fleeing her arranged marriage. When Apache warrior Nalnish steps forward claiming she ran to him, two worlds collide in a story of forbidden love, cultural clash, and the fight for freedom in the changing American Southwest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plaza of San Rafael, Arizona Territory as the church bells chimed 7 times. Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the cool iron bars of her cell window, watching the townspeople gather in the square below. Their excited chatter drifted up to her, punctuated by the occasional laugh or shout. It was market day, but today the usual vendors' stalls were pushed aside to make room for something else entirely. A wooden post had been erected in the center of the plaza, its surface already darkened with stains from previous punishments. Elena's stomach churned as she recognized the leather straps hanging from iron rings, still damp from yesterday's rain. She closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing, but the metallic taste of fear coated her tongue. Elena. The voice belonged to Father Miguel, the parish priest who had served as her confessor since childhood. His weathered face appeared in the small window of her cell door, creased with concern and something that might have been doubt. "Are you prepared to confess your sin before God and this community?" She turned from the window, her dark eyes meeting his with a defiance that surprised them both. "What sin, Padre? The sin of refusing to marry a man who beats his horses and drinks away his wages, or the sin of believing I deserve better than a life of servitude?" Father Miguel's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "The sin of abandoning your family's honor and bringing shame upon your father's name. Don Santiago has been more than patient with your rebellious nature. He offered you a good marriage, a stable home, a cage," Elena whispered, sinking onto the narrow wooden bench that served as her bed. "You call it a good marriage, but I call it a cage with prettier bars." The priest was quiet for a long moment, studying her face through the iron grating. At 22, Elena possessed the kind of beauty that made men forget their words and women whisper behind their fans. Her olive skin held the warmth of the desert sun, and her black hair caught the light like polished obsidian. But it was her eyes that truly set her apart, intelligent, passionate, and utterly uncompromising. "Your father has arranged for Dr. Harrison to examine you," Father Miguel said finally. "If you are found to be intact, the punishment will be reduced." Elena's cheeks burned with humiliation. "And if I am not? 20 lashes instead of 10. She laughed bitterly. How generous. "And what of my supposed lover? What of the man I allegedly ran to in the night? No one believes you acted alone," the priest admitted. "Someone helped you. Someone provided you with supplies, with protection during those 3 days you were missing. If you name him, show true repentance, perhaps nothing," Elena interrupted. "I will not purchase my freedom with lies." Through the window, she could hear the crowd growing larger, their voices rising in anticipation. The territorial governor had instituted these public punishments as a means of maintaining order in the frontier settlements, but Elena suspected they served more as entertainment than justice. In a land where life was harsh and uncertain, the suffering of others provided a grim form of relief. The heavy wooden door of the jail creaked open, and Sheriff Tom Bradley entered, his silver badge catching the morning light. He was a tall man, lean from years of hard living, with gray streaking his brown hair and lines etched deep around his blue eyes. Unlike many lawmen in the territory, Bradley was known for his fairness, but he was also a man who followed the letter of the law. "Time to go, Miss Vasquez," he said quietly, producing a set of shackles from his belt. "I'm sorry it's come to this." Elena stood slowly, straightening her shoulders with the pride that had gotten her into this situation in the first place. "I am not sorry, Sheriff. I am not sorry for refusing to live as a prisoner in my own home." Bradley's expression was unreadable as he secured the shackles around her wrists. The metal was cold against her skin and heavier than she had expected. "Your father is waiting outside. He asked to speak with you before his daughter is beaten like a common criminal." Elena's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. How thoughtful of him. As they walked through the narrow corridor toward the jail's entrance, Elena's mind drifted to the 3 days she had spent in the desert. 3 days of freedom, of breathing air that didn't taste of resignation and compromise. She had survived on cactus fruit and rainwater, slept under stars that seemed impossibly bright, and for the first time in her life, she had felt truly alive. The sunlight was blinding after the dimness of her cell, and Elena squinted as her eyes adjusted. The crowd had grown even larger, with people pressed shoulder to shoulder around the plaza. She recognized many faces: the baker's wife, who had always been kind to her, the young schoolteacher who had encouraged her to read, the store owner who had given her penny candy as a child. Now they all stared at her with a mixture of pity and excitement. Don Santiago Vasquez stood near the sheriff's office, his weathered face a mask of controlled fury. At 55, he was still a formidable man, his shoulders broad from years of ranching and his hands calloused from honest work. But his dark eyes, so similar to Eleanor's own, held a pain that went deeper than anger. "Mija," he said as she approached, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why? Why did you do this to our family?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Because you gave me no choice, Papa. You arranged my marriage as if I were livestock to be traded." "Eduardo Morales is a good man," her father insisted. "He would have provided for you, protected you." "He would have owned me," Elena replied. "Just as you believe you own me now." Don Santiago's face darkened. "You are my daughter. It is my right and my duty to see you properly married. And it is my right to refuse," Elena said, her voice rising. "I am not cattle to be sold at market." Sheriff Bradley stepped between them, his expression grim. "That's enough, we need to proceed." As they walked toward the plaza, Eleanor became aware of the crowd's murmur shifting to something more intense. People were pointing and whispering, their attention focused not on her, but on something beyond her vision. She turned to follow their gazes and felt her breath catch in her throat. At the edge of the plaza, where the desert met the settlement, a lone figure sat motionless on horseback. Even at a distance, she could see that he was Apache, his long black hair, the way he held himself, the beaded decoration on his shirt. But it was his stillness that was most striking, the way he seemed to belong to the landscape itself. "Jesus Christ," Sheriff Bradley muttered, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "What's he doing here?" The crowd's excitement had turned to nervous tension. Apache raids were still fresh in the collective memory, and the presence of a warrior in the town square was unprecedented. Some people began to back away while others pressed closer, their curiosity overcoming their fear. "Should we?" one of Bradley's deputies began. "No," the sheriff said firmly. "He's not armed for war, and he's alone." He paused, studying the distant figure. "Besides, we have a job to do here." As they continued toward the whipping post, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at the Apache warrior. There was something familiar about his posture, the way he held his head. But that was impossible. She had never seen an Apache up close, had certainly never spoken to one. Father Miguel was waiting beside the post, his Bible open in his hands. "Elena Vasquez," he began, his voice carrying across the plaza, "you stand accused of abandoning your family home, of fleeing your lawful betrothal, and of bringing dishonor upon your father's name. Before God and this community, do you confess your guilt?" Elena raised her chin, her voice clear and strong. "I confess only to claiming my freedom, Father. If that is a crime, then I am guilty." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded approvingly at her defiance, while others shook their heads in disapproval. Elena's eyes found the Apache warrior again, and this time she was certain he was looking directly at her. "Very well," Father Miguel said reluctantly. "Elena Vasquez, you are sentenced to 10 lashes for the crime of abandoning your family and betrothal. May God have mercy on your soul." Sheriff Bradley began to untie the leather straps from the post, his movements slow and deliberate. Elena could see the reluctance in his actions, the way his jaw was set with distaste for what he was about to do. But she also knew he would do it. He was a man who followed orders, who believed in the law even when it demanded cruelty. "Remove your blouse," Bradley said quietly, not meeting her eyes. Eleanor's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she began to unbutton her white cotton blouse with steady fingers. The crowd had grown completely silent, watching her every movement with a mix of anticipation and discomfort. She could feel their eyes on her like a physical weight. Wait. The voice came from behind her, strong and clear despite the accent that marked the speaker as Apache. Eleanor turned, her heart pounding, to see the warrior striding through the crowd. People scattered before him like leaves before a strong wind, their faces reflecting fear and confusion. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of a man accustomed to hard living. His skin was bronzed by the sun, and his black hair hung past his shoulders, held back by a band of woven leather. He wore traditional Apache clothing, a shirt of soft deerskin decorated with blue and white beads, and pants that reached just below his knees. But it was his eyes that captured Elena's attention, dark and intelligent, with a depth that spoke of wisdom beyond his years. "I am Nalnish," he said, his English careful but clear. "This woman speaks truth. She did not abandon her family." He paused, his gaze moving from Elena to the crowd and back again. "She ran to me." The plaza erupted in chaos. People shouted and pushed, some reaching for weapons while others simply stared in shock. Sheriff Bradley's hand was on his gun, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. Don Santiago's face had gone pale, and Father Miguel clutched his Bible to his chest as if it were a shield. "You're saying she was with you?" Bradley asked, his voice tight with tension. "For 3 days?" Nalnish nodded solemnly. 3 days, 3 nights. She came to me freely as woman comes to man she chooses. Elena felt the world spinning around her. This was impossible. She had never met this man, had never seen him before today, but as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch. He was lying to protect her, risking his own life to spare her from the lash. "That's impossible," Don Santiago sputtered. "My daughter would never—" "Your daughter is brave," Nalnish interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the crowd. "She chose freedom over chains. She chose love over duty." He looked directly at Elena, and she saw the message in his eyes. "Play along. Trust me." Elena's mind raced. If she confirmed his story, she would be admitting to a relationship with an Apache warrior, a scandal that would destroy her family's reputation and likely result in exile or worse. But if she denied it, he would face the crowd's anger alone, and she would still face the lash. "Is this true?" Father Miguel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena looked at the Apache warrior, at this stranger who had stepped forward to save her from public humiliation. She thought of the 3 days she had spent in the desert, of the freedom she had tasted and lost, and she made her choice. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the stunned plaza. "It is true." The crowd's reaction was immediate and violent. Men shouted for justice, women gasped in horror, and children were quickly pulled away from the scene. But Elena kept her eyes on Nalnish, seeing in his face a mixture of relief and something deeper, respect, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. Sheriff Bradley raised his hand for silence, his face grim. "This changes everything," he said. "If what you say is true, then we have a different crime entirely." He looked from Elena to Nalnish and back again. "Cohabitation between a white woman and an Apache is a territorial offense. The penalty is—" "I know the penalty," Nalnish interrupted calmly. "I accept it." Elena's heart pounded as she realized what he was saying. He was willing to die for her, this stranger who owed her nothing. The weight of his sacrifice pressed down on her like a physical force. "No," she said suddenly, stepping forward. "No, you don't understand. But Nalnish shook his head slightly and she fell silent. Whatever game he was playing, whatever plan he had, she had to trust him. She had to trust this Apache warrior who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the crowd pressed closer, their voices rising in a cacophony of outrage and excitement. Elena stood between two worlds, the world of her birth, with its rules and expectations and crushing limitations, and the world represented by the man beside her, wild and free and dangerous. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in her life she felt truly alive. The silence that followed Elena's confirmation stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Sheriff Bradley's weathered face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his hand remained poised over his gun holster. The crowd pressed closer, their collective breathing creating a low murmur that seemed to pulse with the desert heat. "Step away from her, Apache," called out Eduardo Morales, Elena's rejected suitor, as he pushed through the crowd. His round face was flushed with anger and humiliation, his small eyes darting between Elena and Nalnish with barely contained rage. "You have no right to be here." Nalnish didn't move, his dark eyes fixed on Eduardo with the steady gaze of a predator assessing potential prey. "I have right of man who protects woman he loves," he said quietly, his accented English carrying clearly across the plaza. "What right do you have?" "The right of a betrothed man," Eduardo sputtered, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "She was promised to me by her father. This savage has stolen what belongs to me." Elena felt something dangerous kindle in her chest. "I belong to no one," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Not to you, not to my father, not to any man who thinks he can claim me like property." Don Santiago stepped forward, his face twisted with shame and fury. "Enough, Elena. You have disgraced our family name beyond repair. First you flee like a common criminal, and now you admit to this unholy union." He gestured toward Nalnish with disgust, Do you have any idea what you've done? I have chosen my own path, Elena replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. For the first time in my life, I have made a choice that was mine alone. Father Miguel clutched his Bible tighter, his knuckles white against the leather binding. Elena, child, think of your immortal soul. This man is a heathen, a warrior who has likely killed Christians. How can I what, Father? Elena interrupted, her patience finally snapping. How can I choose love over duty? How can I choose freedom over chains? How can I choose to live as a human being rather than a piece of property to be bartered and sold? The priest's face crumpled with genuine pain. I baptized you, child. I watched you grow from a sweet girl into a beautiful woman. I cannot stand by and watch you damn yourself for the sake of rebellion. Nalnish spoke then, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Your God made all people, Apache, Mexican, white man. If he made us, then he made the feelings between us. What is unholy about love that harms no one? The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Someone threw a stone that struck the ground near Nalnish's feet, but he didn't flinch. Elena watched him with growing amazement. This stranger who had appeared from nowhere to defend her, who stood calm and unafraid in the face of a hostile mob. Sheriff Bradley raised his hand for silence, his face grim with the weight of his responsibilities. This is getting out of hand, he said loudly. Everyone needs to step back and let the law handle this. What law? Demanded Tom Fletcher, the town's blacksmith, his powerful arms crossed over his chest. What law protects a white woman who beds down with Apache savages? What law lets them walk among us like civilized people? The same law that protects all citizens of the territory, Bradley replied firmly. And the same law that will punish those who break it. He looked directly at Elena and Nalnish. Both of you need to come with me, now. As Bradley reached for his shackles, Elena caught something in Nalnish's posture, a subtle shift that spoke of coiled readiness. His eyes never left the sheriff's face, but she sensed that he was aware of every person in the crowd, every potential threat or escape route. There's no need for shackles, Nalnish said calmly. I give my word we will not try to escape. Bradley paused, studying the Apache warrior's face. Your word? My word as warrior, as man who speaks truth before his ancestors and yours. The sheriff considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but one wrong move and you'll both be in irons. As they began to walk toward the jail, Elena felt the crowd's hostility like a physical weight. She could hear the whispered curses, the threats, the speculation about what should be done with them. But she also heard something else, a few voices raised in quiet defense, questioning the mob's bloodthirst. Maria Santos was right about this, she heard Mrs. Chen, the laundry woman, say to her neighbor. A woman should have some say in who she marries, but with an Apache, came the scandalized reply. Apache or not, he's showing more honor than most of the men in this town, Mrs. Chen responded tartly. When's the last time you saw a man risk his life to protect a woman's dignity? Elena glanced back at Nalnish, walking beside her with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in his own skin. The morning sun caught the blue and white beads on his shirt, and she found herself wondering about the hands that had sewn them, the traditions they represented, the life he had led before this moment. Why? She asked quietly, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear. Why did you lie for me? Nalnish was quiet for so long that Elena thought he might not answer. Then, just as they reached the jail's entrance, he spoke. Sometimes truth is bigger than facts. Sometimes what should be matters more than what is. Before Elena could ask what he meant, Sheriff Bradley was ushering them inside. The jail was cooler than the plaza, but the air felt heavy with tension. Bradley gestured toward the single cell, its iron bars casting shadows across the wooden floor. I can't put you in there together, he said, his voice apologetic but firm. Miss Vasquez, you'll have to return to the women's cell. And you, he looked at Nalnish, you'll be in the main cell until I can figure out what to do with this situation. Sheriff, Elena said suddenly, what will happen to us? Bradley's expression was troubled. I don't know, Miss Vasquez. This isn't something I've dealt with before. Territorial law is clear about certain things, but he trailed off, shaking his head. But what? Elena pressed. But proving cohabitation is different from proving adultery, and both of you are unmarried. He paused, studying their faces. If you were to marry legally, it would change things considerably. Elena felt her heart skip. Marry? It's been done before, Bradley said carefully. Mixed marriages aren't common, but they're not illegal under territorial law. The federal government recognizes them, even if local communities don't approve. Nalnish stepped forward, his expression serious. This is possible. Apache man can marry Mexican woman under your law? If both parties consent, and if proper procedures are followed, yes. Bradley looked between them. But I have to warn you, the social consequences would be severe. You'd likely have to leave San Rafael, possibly leave the territory entirely. Elena's mind raced. Marriage to a complete stranger, exile from the only home she had ever known, life as an outcast in a hostile world. But as she looked at Nalnish, she saw something in his eyes that gave her courage. Not love, not yet, but respect, and perhaps given time, something more. I need to think, she said finally. Don't take too long, Bradley advised. The territorial judge arrives next week. If you're going to do this, it needs to be soon. As they were led to their separate cells, Elena caught Nalnish's eye one last time. What's your real name? She asked. Your full name? He smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. Nalnish means he who wins. My grandfather gave it to me after I survived the smallpox as a child. My white name, the one missionaries gave me, is David, but I am Nalnish to those who know me. Elena, she said simply. My name is Elena Vasquez. Elena, he repeated, the way he said it making it sound like music. It means bright light in the language of your people. As the cell door closed behind her, Elena sank onto the narrow bench and tried to process everything that had happened. 3 hours ago, she had been preparing for a public whipping. Now she was contemplating marriage to an Apache warrior who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. Through the small window, she could see the crowd in the plaza slowly dispersing. Some people lingered, still talking animatedly about the morning's events. Others walked away, shaking their heads, as if trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become more complicated than they had expected. Elena closed her eyes and tried to imagine what her life might look like if she accepted this strange proposal. She would be leaving behind everything familiar, her family, her home, her culture, but she would also be leaving behind the suffocating expectations that had threatened to destroy her spirit. In the cell across the corridor, she could hear Nalnish moving quietly, his presence somehow comforting despite the circumstances. He had saved her from public humiliation, had offered her a path to freedom that she had never imagined possible. But what kind of life could they build together? Two strangers from different worlds, united only by a shared desire for something better. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the cell floor. Elena thought about the 3 days she had spent in the desert, the taste of freedom she had experienced so briefly. If she married Nalnish, she would be free again, free to choose her own path, to live by her own rules, to discover who she might become without the weight of other people's expectations. But freedom, she was beginning to understand, always came with a price. The question was whether she was brave enough to pay it. Outside, the church bells began to toll, marking the end of another day in San Rafael. Elena listened to their familiar sound and wondered if she would ever hear them again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new consequences. But for the first time in her life, those choices would be hers to make. She thought of her father's disappointment, of Father Miguel's concern, of the scandal that would follow her name for years to come. But she also thought of Nalnish's quiet courage, of the respect she had seen in his eyes, of the possibility of a life lived on her own terms. The sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elena watched the colors fade to purple, then to black, and made her decision. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, she would choose freedom. She would choose to live. Dawn broke over San Rafael with the promise of another scorching day, but Elena had been awake for hours, watching the stars fade from the narrow window of her cell. Sleep had eluded her as she wrestled with the impossible choice before her: marry a stranger and face exile, or remain and accept whatever punishment the territorial judge might impose. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention to the corridor. Sheriff Bradley appeared, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of beans and tortillas. His face was haggard, suggesting he had slept as poorly as she had. "Breakfast," he said, sliding the plate through the slot in the cell door. "Mrs. Bradley insisted I bring you something decent to eat." Eleanor accepted the food gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten since the previous morning. "Thank you, Sheriff, and please thank your wife for her kindness." Bradley lingered, his expression troubled. "Miss Vasquez, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did you really spend those 3 days with him?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Why does it matter now? We've already told you what happened." "Because I've been thinking about this all night," Bradley said, lowering his voice, "and something doesn't add up. You were gone for 3 days, yes, but there were no Apache camps reported in the area. No signs of anyone living rough in the desert. Where exactly did you stay? Elena's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice calm. The desert is vast, Sheriff. There are many places to hide if you know where to look. That's just it, Bradley pressed. You don't know where to look. You're a town girl, Elena. You've never spent a night outside these walls in your life. How did you survive 3 days in the desert without dying of thirst or exposure? Before Elena could answer, another voice cut through the morning air. Because she is stronger than you think. Both Elena and Bradley turned to see Nalnish approaching from his cell, his movements fluid despite the confines of the jail. He had been listening, Elena realized, and had chosen this moment to intervene. Strength alone doesn't find water in the desert, Bradley said, his tone skeptical. Or know which plants are safe to eat, or how to build shelter from the sun. Nalnish smiled, but there was no humor in it. You think Apache men are born knowing these things? We learn from our mothers, our grandmothers, women who know the desert as well as any warrior. He paused, his dark eyes meeting Elena's. Some knowledge passes between people who care for each other. Elena felt a flutter of something she couldn't name. He was protecting her again, weaving a story that would explain her survival without revealing the truth, that she had never been with him at all, that she had spent those 3 days hiding in the abandoned mining shack 5 miles north of town, living on water from a hidden spring, and the dried meat she had stolen from her father's storehouse. I see, Bradley said slowly, though his expression suggested he saw more than he was letting on. And you're both prepared to swear to this story before Judge Morrison. We are, Eleanor said firmly, surprised by her own certainty. Bradley nodded and walked away, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and the distant sound of Nalnish moving in his cell. She finished her breakfast in silence, acutely aware of his presence just a few feet away. This man who had saved her from public humiliation, who continued to protect her with his silence, was still a complete stranger to her. Nalnish, she called softly. Yes? Tell me about your people, your family. There was a long pause before he answered. My mother died when I was 12, tuberculosis. My father was killed in a raid against the cavalry 3 years later. I was raised by my grandmother, who taught me the old ways, the old stories. Elena absorbed this information, trying to imagine the losses he had endured. And now? Do you have family now? I have my band, my brothers in arms. We live in the mountains, away from the reservations where the government tries to make us into something we are not. His voice carried a note of sadness. But family in the way you mean? No, I am alone. Why? Elena asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. It is fair question, Nalnish interrupted. I have not found woman who could accept my life. Apache women want warrior who stays close to home, who follows traditional ways, but I cannot live on reservation, cannot pretend to be tame for the sake of government peace. Eleanor understood more than he knew. You're caught between two worlds, aren't you? Too traditional for the reservation, too independent for your own people. Yes, he said simply, like you are caught between duty and freedom. The observation hit her like a physical blow. He saw her so clearly, this stranger who had known her for less than 24 hours. He understood her struggle in a way that her own family never had. Nalnish, she said carefully, what you did yesterday claiming I was with you, it was a lie. We both know that. Was it? His voice was thoughtful. Perhaps you did not run to me in body but in spirit. Perhaps the woman who chose 3 days of freedom over a lifetime of chains was already running towards something better. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. You're a poet as well as a warrior. My grandmother always said that words are the most powerful weapon. A sword can kill one man, but the right words can change the world. Before Elena could respond, the jail door opened again. This time it was Father Miguel, his face grave with concern. He carried his worn Bible and a small leather pouch that Elena recognized as containing the oils for last rites. Elena, child, he said gently, I've come to give you a chance to confess your sins and seek absolution before it's too late. Elena rose from her bench, squaring her shoulders. I have nothing to confess, Father. I've committed no sin. You've admitted to lying with a heathen man outside the bonds of holy matrimony, Father Miguel said, his voice pained. That is fornication, Elena. It is a mortal sin. And what of the sin of forcing a woman into marriage against her will? Elena shot back. What of the sin of treating a human being like property to be bought and sold? The priest's face crumpled. I know you're angry, child. I know you feel trapped. But there are proper ways to handle these things. If you had come to me, if you had explained your feelings about Eduardo, you would have told me to pray for acceptance. Elena interrupted. You would have reminded me of my duty to obey my father, to submit to his will in all things. Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment. Perhaps, he admitted finally, but that doesn't change the fact that you've chosen a path that leads to damnation. Whose damnation? Nalnish's voice carried clearly from his cell. Mine for loving woman who deserves better than she has been given? Or yours for blessing system that treats women like animals? The priest whirled toward the sound of his voice. You will not speak to me of damnation, savage. You worship false gods and practice heathen rituals. I worship the Creator who made all things, Nalnish replied calmly. I follow the path of my ancestors who lived in harmony with the earth for thousands of years before your people came. If this is damnation, then I accept it gladly. Eleanor watched the exchange with growing admiration for Nalnish's composure. He faced the priest's hostility without anger, responding to insults with quiet dignity. She had never seen a man handle conflict with such grace. Father, she said, drawing the priest's attention back to her, I know you care about my soul, but I need you to understand something. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living according to God's will for me. Not my father's will, not Eduardo's will, not even your will, but God's will. How can you say that? Father Miguel asked, his voice breaking. How can you claim that adultery with a savage is God's will? Because, Elena said, her voice gaining strength, God gave me a mind to think, a heart to feel, and a will to choose. If he wanted me to be a mindless breeding animal, he would have made me one. But he made me human, with the capacity for love, for choice, for freedom. The priest stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions, pain, confusion, and something that might have been understanding. Finally, he shook his head sadly. I will pray for you, Eleanor. I will pray that you find your way back to the path of righteousness before it's too late. As Father Miguel left, Elena felt a profound sense of loss. She had known him all her life, had trusted him with her deepest fears and hopes, but she also felt a strange sense of liberation, as if she had finally spoken truths that had been locked inside her for years. That was brave, Nalnish said quietly. It was necessary, Elena replied. I'm tired of apologizing for who I am, for what I want. And what do you want? Elena considered the question seriously. I want to matter. I want my choices to be my own. I want to love someone who sees me as a person, not a possession. She paused, then added quietly, I want to be free. Freedom is not free, Nalnish said. It costs everything you have been, everything you thought you wanted. Are you prepared to pay that price? Elena thought of her father's disappointment, of the scandal that would follow her name, of the comfortable life she was abandoning. Then she thought of Eduardo's small, cruel eyes, of the suffocating expectations that had nearly destroyed her spirit, of the woman she might become if she stayed. Yes, she said finally, I'm prepared to pay it. As if summoned by her words, Sheriff Bradley appeared in the corridor again, his face grim. Miss Vasquez, your father is here. He wants to speak with you. Eleanor's heart sank. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that her father's pain would be harder to bear than the crowd's anger or the priest's disapproval. Send him in, she said quietly. Don Santiago entered the jail like a man walking to his own execution. His proud shoulders were bowed, his weathered face etched with lines of grief and shame. He looked older than his 55 years, as if the events of the past day had aged him by decades. Mija, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What have you done to us? Elena felt tears spill down her cheeks. Papa, The whole territory will know by tomorrow, he continued, his voice growing stronger with anger. My daughter, my precious daughter, has chosen a savage over her own kind. Do you have any idea what this means for our family, for your sisters? I know, Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. I know what it costs, but Papa, you have to understand. I can't live the life you planned for me. I can't marry Eduardo. I can't pretend to be happy in a cage, even a golden one. Don Santiago's face hardened. So you choose disgrace instead? You choose to destroy everything our family has built? I choose to be human, Elena replied. I choose to live as God made me, not as you would shape me. Her father stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes, so like her own, filled with pain and disappointment. Then you are no longer my daughter, he said finally. If you go through with this madness, you will be dead to me. The words hit Elena like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain standing. I understand, Papa. I'm sorry it has to be this way. Don Santiago turned to go, then paused at the door. Your mother would be ashamed, he said without looking back. She would weep to see what you've become. As her father's footsteps faded down the corridor, Eleanor sank onto her bench and let the tears come. She had known this moment would arrive, had prepared herself for it as well as she could, but nothing could have prepared her for the finality of it, the crushing weight of losing her family's love. "I am sorry," Nalnish said gently from his cell. "I know what it means to lose family." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "No, you don't understand. I'm not crying because I'm sorry. I'm crying because I'm free." The truth of her words surprised her. Despite the pain, despite the loss, she felt lighter than she had in years. The chains that had bound her to other people's expectations had finally been broken. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Nalnish said, "we face tomorrow together, as husband and wife, if you will have me." Elena stood up and walked to the bars that separated their cells. Nalnish was standing at his own bars, and for the first time, she could see his face clearly. He was handsome in a way that was completely foreign to her. Sharp cheekbones, eyes like polished obsidian, skin bronzed by sun and wind. But it was his expression that captured her attention, patient, kind, and absolutely resolute. "I don't love you," she said honestly. "I don't even know you." "I know," he replied, "but we have time to learn these things, if we choose to." Elena reached through the bars and touched his hand. His skin was warm, calloused from years of hard living, but gentle as he closed his fingers around hers. "Then I choose," she said. "I choose you, I choose freedom. I choose to discover who I might become." Nalnish smiled, and for the first time, Eleanor saw genuine joy in his eyes. "Then we will discover together." Outside, the church bells began to toll, marking the end of another day in San Rafael. But for Eleanor, it felt like the beginning of everything. 3 days later, the territorial courthouse in San Rafael had never seen a crowd quite like the one gathered outside its adobe walls. Word of the impending marriage between Elena Vasquez and the Apache warrior called Nalnish had spread throughout the territory like wildfire, drawing curious onlookers, outraged citizens, and a few unexpected supporters from as far as Tucson and Phoenix. Judge Elias Morrison, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, had arrived the previous evening on the weekly stagecoach. He brought with him 30 years of experience in territorial law and a reputation for fairness that had earned him respect from both settlers and tribal leaders. As he prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most controversial case of his career, he reviewed the relevant statutes with the careful attention of a man who understood that his decision would have consequences far beyond this small frontier town. Elena stood before her cell's small mirror, trying to make herself presentable for what would either be her wedding day or her sentencing. She had washed as best she could with the basin of water Mrs. Bradley had provided, and braided her long black hair with a strip of blue ribbon that the sheriff's wife had quietly slipped her along with breakfast. Her white cotton dress, the same one she had been arrested in, was wrinkled and stained, but it was all she had. "You look beautiful," came Nalnish's voice from the adjacent cell. Eleanor turned toward the sound, feeling a flutter of nerves that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings ahead. Over the past 3 days, she and Nalnish had talked for hours through the bars that separated them, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. She had learned that he spoke 3 languages fluently, that he had once saved a cavalry officer's life during a flash flood, and that he could recite Apache legends that stretched back generations. He had learned that she could read and write in both Spanish and English, that she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, and that she made the best sopapillas in San Rafael. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "of marrying me or of what comes after." Elena considered the question seriously. "Both, I think. This morning I woke up Elena Vasquez, daughter of a respected rancher. Tonight I'll go to sleep as the wife of an Apache warrior. I don't know who that person is yet." "She is the same woman who chose freedom over comfort," Nalnish said gently. "The same woman who faced down an angry mob rather than live a lie. You know who you are, Elena. Marriage will not change that." Before Elena could respond, Sheriff Bradley appeared in the corridor, his face set in grim lines. "It's time," he said simply. As they walked toward the courthouse, Elena was struck by the surreal quality of the morning. The sun shone with typical Arizona brilliance, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber. Birds sang in the mesquite trees, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. It seemed impossible that such an ordinary morning could mark such an extraordinary transformation in her life. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with people standing 3 deep along the walls and spilling out into the street. Elena recognized many faces from San Rafael, but there were also strangers, reporters from territorial newspapers, curious travelers, and a delegation of Apache men who sat in the back with the quiet dignity of people accustomed to being unwelcome guests. Judge Morrison sat behind a heavy wooden desk that had been moved to the front of the room for the occasion. His weathered face was impassive as he surveyed the crowd, but Elena caught a flicker of something, perhaps amusement, in his eyes as he took in the theatrical nature of the proceedings. "This court is now in session," he announced in a voice that carried easily through the packed room. "We are here to address two matters. First, the charges against Elena Vasquez and the man known as Nalnish for alleged cohabitation outside of marriage, and second, their petition for legal marriage under territorial law." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Elena felt every eye in the room fixed upon her. She forced herself to stand straight, to meet the judge's gaze with the dignity she had learned from watching Nalnish face down hostile crowds. "Miss Vasquez," Judge Morrison continued, "you stand accused of abandoning your family home and engaging in illicit relations with this man. How do you plead?" Elena's voice was clear and steady. "Not guilty, Your Honor." "And you, Nalnish, how do you plead to the same charges?" "Not guilty," Nalnish replied, his accented English carrying clearly through the room. Judge Morrison nodded and consulted the papers before him. "I've reviewed the evidence in this case, such as it is. The testimony consists entirely of your own admissions and the observations of various townspeople. There are no witnesses to any alleged impropriety, no physical evidence of cohabitation, and no testimony from anyone who actually saw you together during the period in question." Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the judge saw through the fiction they had created. "However," Morrison continued, "you have both sworn under oath that you were together for 3 days and nights as man and woman. If this is true, then you are guilty of the charges. If it is false, then you have committed perjury in my court." He leaned forward, his piercing gaze moving between them. "I ask you now, one final time, do you maintain that you were together as lovers during those 3 days?" Elena felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was her last chance to tell the truth, to admit that she had been alone in the desert, that Nalnish had lied to protect her. But as she looked at him, saw the quiet courage in his dark eyes, she knew that the truth they had created together was more important than the facts of what had actually happened. "Yes, Your Honor," she said firmly. "We were together." "Yes," Nalnish echoed. "We were together." Judge Morrison studied them for a long moment, and Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through their deception. But when he spoke, his voice was measured and professional. "Very well. Given your admissions, I find you both guilty of cohabitation outside of marriage. However, I note that both parties are unmarried adults who entered into this relationship of their own free will. Furthermore, you have petitioned this court for legal marriage, which would resolve the legal issues raised by your conduct." He paused, looking out at the packed courtroom. "I also note that territorial law explicitly permits marriage between individuals of different racial backgrounds, provided both parties consent and proper procedures are followed. The federal government has confirmed this interpretation." A wave of angry murmurs swept through the crowd, but Morrison silenced them with a sharp look. "Therefore," he continued, "I am prepared to perform the marriage ceremony here and now if both parties consent. This will resolve the criminal charges and regularize your union under territorial law." Eleanor felt her heart pounding as the moment of final decision arrived. Around her, the crowd buzzed with excitement and outrage, but she was aware only of Nalnish beside her, steady and calm as always. "Do you, Elena Vasquez, consent to marry this man?" Judge Morrison asked. Elena looked at Nalnish, this stranger who had become her partner in the most important decision of her life. She thought of all the reasons she should say no. They barely knew each other. Their backgrounds were completely different. They would face a lifetime of prejudice and hardship, but she also thought of the alternative, returning to a life of suffocating expectations, of being property rather than a person. "I do," she said clearly. "And do you, Nalnish, consent to marry this woman?" "I do," he replied without hesitation. Morrison nodded. "Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife." He paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You may kiss your bride." Elena turned to face her new husband, acutely aware that hundreds of people were watching this most intimate moment. Nalnish stepped closer, his hands gentle as he cupped her face. When his lips touched hers, she felt a jolt of something she hadn't expected. Not love, not yet, but the promise of it. The kiss was soft, respectful, and somehow full of hope. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Some people cheered, others shouted protests, and still others simply stared in stunned silence. Eleanor heard her name called out, some voices expressing support, others hurling insults, but she found she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she chose to be. "Congratulations, Mrs. Judge Morrison paused, raising an eyebrow. "I'm afraid we need to establish what name you'll be taking." Eleanor looked at Nalnish, realizing they hadn't discussed this detail. In Apache culture, she knew, naming conventions were different from Mexican or American traditions. "Elena Nalnish," she said decisively, "if that's acceptable to my husband." Nalnish's smile was radiant. "It is more than acceptable. It is perfect." As they signed the marriage certificate, Eleanor noticed that Nalnish wrote his name with careful, precise letters. Someone had taught him to write in English, she realized, and taught him well. There was so much about this man she didn't know, so many discoveries yet to be made. Sheriff Bradley approached them as the crowd began to disperse, his expression thoughtful. "You'll need to leave town," he said quietly. "Today. There are already people talking about vigilante justice, and I can't guarantee your safety if you stay." Eleanor felt a chill of fear, but Nalnish simply nodded. "We understand. We are prepared." "Where will you go?" Bradley asked. "West," Nalnish said. "To California, perhaps. There are places where people like us can make a life." Bradley reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "It's not much, but it should get you started. From my wife and me. We wish you luck." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything." As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Eleanor caught sight of her father standing near the back of the room. Don Santiago's face was a mask of pain and disappointment, but when their eyes met, she saw something else there, a flicker of what might have been respect, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. "Goodbye, Papa," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear her over the crowd's noise, but needing to say it anyway. Outside, the Apache delegation approached them. The eldest, a man with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes, spoke to Nalnish in their native language. Eleanor couldn't understand the words, but she heard the respect in the man's voice, saw the approval in his gesture. "My grandfather's brother," Nalnish explained to Elena. "He says the spirits guided me to do the right thing. He says you have the heart of a warrior." Elena felt honored by the assessment, even as she wondered what kind of life she and Nalnish would build together. They had a marriage certificate, a few dollars, and each other. It wasn't much to start a new life with, but it was more than she had ever had when she was living according to other people's expectations. As they walked through the streets of San Rafael for what Elena knew would be the last time, people stared and whispered, but she held her head high. She was no longer Elena Vasquez, the rebellious daughter who had brought shame on her family's name. She was Elena Nalnish, a woman who had chosen her own path. "Are you ready?" Nalnish asked as they reached the edge of town, where two horses waited, his own and one borrowed from a sympathetic ranch hand. Eleanor looked back at the only home she had ever known, at the adobe buildings and familiar faces that had shaped her life for 22 years. Then she looked at her husband, this man who had given her the gift of choice, and smiled. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. They rode west toward the setting sun, toward California and whatever future they would build together. Behind them, San Rafael gradually disappeared into the desert haze. But Elena didn't look back. She was too busy looking forward, too eager to discover who she might become in this new life she had chosen. The desert stretched endlessly before them, vast and challenging and full of possibilities. For the first time in her life, Elena felt truly free. 6 weeks later, Elena woke to the sound of wind whistling through the canvas walls of their makeshift shelter. The morning air carried the bite of approaching winter, and she pulled the worn woolen blanket closer around her shoulders as she listened to the familiar sounds of Nalnish moving quietly outside, tending to their horses and preparing for another day's journey. Their westward trek had proven more challenging than either had anticipated. What Elena had imagined as a romantic adventure had quickly revealed itself as a harsh education in survival. The money Sheriff Bradley had given them was nearly gone, spent on supplies and the occasional night's lodging in towns where they could find merchants willing to serve them. More often than not, they had been turned away from hotels and boarding houses, forced to make camp in the desert with only their horses for company. Elena's hands, once soft from a life of domestic comfort, were now calloused and scarred from gathering firewood and handling rough rope. Her face had been bronzed by the desert sun, despite the wide-brimmed hat Nalnish had traded for in their last town, and her hair had grown wild from weeks without proper washing. She barely recognized herself in the small mirror they carried in their saddlebags. "Good morning, wife," Nalnish said as he ducked through the canvas flap, carrying a tin cup of coffee that steamed in the cool air. The endearment still sounded strange to Elena's ears, but she had grown to appreciate the gentle way he said it, as if he were still amazed by the reality of their union. "Good morning, husband," she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The bitter brew was made from grounds they had used 3 times already, but it was warm and helped chase away the morning chill. Nalnish settled beside her on their shared bedroll, careful to maintain the respectful distance that had characterized their sleeping arrangement since leaving San Rafael. They had shared a blanket out of necessity, but Nalnish had never presumed anything beyond what their strange circumstances required. Eleanor appreciated his restraint, even as she found herself increasingly curious about the man she had married. "How far to the next town?" she asked, studying the hand-drawn map they had purchased from a traveling merchant. 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather turns," Nalnish replied, following her gaze. "Willow Creek. The merchant said they have a blacksmith and a general store." Eleanor nodded, but her expression was troubled. Their last encounter with civilization had been less than welcoming. The storekeeper in Dusty Springs had refused to sell them supplies until Nalnish produced twice the asking price in silver coins. The town's sheriff had made it clear they weren't welcome to stay overnight, suggesting they might find the local residents unfriendly after dark. "What if they won't serve us in Willow Creek either?" Eleanor asked, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Nalnish was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was painting the desert sky in shades of pink and gold. "Then we keep moving," he said finally. "California is large. There will be places where we can make a life." Eleanor heard the uncertainty in his voice, the same doubt that had been plaguing her own thoughts. They had been traveling for 6 weeks, based on little more than hope, and the vague promise that California would be more tolerant of their unconventional union. But what if it wasn't? What if the entire American West was as hostile to mixed marriages as the Arizona Territory had proven to be? "Nalnish," she said carefully, "do you ever regret what we did? Do you ever wish you had stayed silent in that plaza?" He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Do you regret it?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. Her body ached from weeks of hard travel. Her stomach was rarely full, and she missed the simple comforts of home more than she cared to admit. But when she thought of the alternative, marriage to Eduardo, a life of quiet desperation, the slow death of her spirit, she knew her answer. "No," she said firmly, "I don't regret it, but I sometimes wonder if we were naive to think this would be easy." Nalnish smiled, and Elena saw a flash of the humor that had sustained them through their darkest moments. "My grandmother used to say that anything worth having comes with a price. The question is whether you're willing to pay it." "And are you?" Elena asked. "Willing to pay it?" Instead of answering immediately, Nalnish reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft deerskin. Elena had seen him handle it before during their journey, always with the reverence of someone touching something sacred. "My grandmother gave me this before she died," he said, unwrapping a beautifully carved wooden eagle, its wings spread in flight. "She said it would guide me to my true path. For years I thought that path was the way of the warrior, fighting against the soldiers and settlers who took our land." He held the carving up to catch the morning light, and Elena could see the intricate details, each feather carefully etched, the fierce expression in the eagle's eyes. "But when I saw you standing in that plaza, facing down an angry mob rather than accept a life you didn't want, I understood what my grandmother meant. My path wasn't about fighting against something. It was about fighting for something better." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You gave up everything for a stranger." "I gave up a life of anger for a chance at something real," Nalnish corrected gently. "You gave me hope, Elena, hope that 2 people from different worlds could build something together." Elena reached out and touched the carved eagle, feeling the smooth wood that had been polished by years of handling. "It's beautiful. It's yours now," Nalnish said, placing the carving in her hands. "We're building this new path together. We should both carry the guidance of our ancestors." Eleanor stared at the gift, overwhelmed by the gesture. In her world, family heirlooms were precious things, passed down through generations with careful ceremony. That Nalnish would give her something so significant spoke to a trust and commitment that went far beyond their practical arrangement. "I can't accept this," she said, trying to hand it back. "It's too important." "Which is exactly why you should have it," Nalnish replied, closing her fingers around the carving. "Important things should be shared with the people who matter most." Before Elena could respond, a new sound reached their ears, the rhythmic pounding of approaching hoofbeats. Both of them tensed, their peaceful morning shattered by the possibility of danger. Nalnish was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the knife at his belt as he peered through a gap in their canvas shelter. 3 riders, he said quietly, coming from the east. Elena felt her heart begin to race. They had been careful to avoid main roads and towns whenever possible, camping in hidden spots that wouldn't attract attention. But the desert was vast and empty, and 3 riders approaching their isolated camp could mean anything from lost travelers seeking directions to a vigilante posse seeking revenge. "What do we do?" Elena whispered. "Stay calm," Nalnish replied, his voice steady despite the tension Elena could see in his shoulders. "Let me do the talking." The riders approached at a steady pace, and as they drew closer, Elena could make out more details. They were well mounted and heavily armed, their clothing marking them as either prosperous ranchers or lawmen. Her stomach clenched with fear as she recognized the type of men who had made their journey so difficult. "Hello, the camp," called the lead rider as they came within hailing distance. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. His voice was firm but not immediately hostile. Nalnish stepped out of their shelter, his hands visible but ready. "Good morning," he replied carefully. The 3 riders stopped about 20 feet away, their horses snorting and stamping in the cool morning air. Elena remained hidden inside the shelter, but she could hear every word of the conversation. "I'm Marshal Peterson from Willow Creek," the lead rider said, dismounting slowly. "We've been tracking a pair of fugitives, a Mexican woman and an Apache man wanted for questioning in connection with a murder in Phoenix." Elena's blood turned to ice. This was exactly what they had feared. False accusations, trumped-up charges designed to justify violence against them. "We are not fugitives," Nalnish said calmly. "We are married travelers heading west." "That's what they all say," sneered the second rider, a younger man with hard eyes and a cruel mouth. "Apache word ain't worth much around these parts." "Quiet, Johnson," Marshal Peterson said sharply. "Let me handle this." He studied Nalnish with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to reading people. "You got papers? Something to prove who you are?" Elena held her breath as Nalnish reached slowly into his shirt and produced their marriage certificate, the official document that Judge Morrison had signed in San Rafael. Peterson examined it carefully, his expression unreadable. "Says here you're married to one Elena Nalnish, formerly Vasquez," he said finally. "Where's your wife?" "Here," Elena said, stepping out of the shelter with as much dignity as she could muster. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to meet the marshal's gaze directly. Peterson's eyes widened slightly as he took in her appearance, the sun-darkened skin, the wild hair, the rough traveling clothes that marked her as someone who had been living hard for weeks. "You're a long way from home, Mrs. Nalnish." "We're going to California," Elena replied, her voice steady despite her fear, "to start a new life." The marshals studied their camp, taking in the meager supplies, the worn equipment, the obvious signs of people who had been traveling on very limited resources. "The folks we're looking for robbed a stagecoach outside Phoenix 6 weeks ago, killed the driver and 2 passengers. 6 weeks ago we were leaving San Rafael after our wedding," Elena said quickly. "Sheriff Bradley can confirm it. Judge Morrison performed the ceremony." Peterson nodded slowly. "I know Bradley. Good man. What about you?" He turned to Nalnish. "You got anyone who can vouch for you?" "My people," Nalnish replied, "but they are far from here." The third rider, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "Marshal, that's them, has to be. How many Apache men you think are traveling with Mexican women?" Elena felt the situation sliding toward violence, saw the way the younger men's hands moved closer to their weapons, but Marshal Peterson held up a hand, his expression thoughtful. "Actually," he said slowly, "I got a telegraph from Judge Morrison yesterday, asked me to keep an eye out for a newly married couple matching your description, said if I found you, I should make sure you were being treated fairly." Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward the judge who had married them. Even after they left his jurisdiction, he was still looking out for them. "Morrison also said," Peterson continued, "that you folks might be interested in some honest work. There's a ranch about 50 miles west of Willow Creek. Owner's looking for hands who can work with horses. Said he doesn't care about a man's blood as long as he's willing to work." Elena and Nalnish exchanged glances, hardly daring to believe what they were hearing. Honest work, a chance to stop running, the possibility of building a real life together. "What kind of ranch?" Nalnish asked carefully. "Horse breeding," Peterson replied. "Man named Williams runs it. Lost most of his crew to the gold fields in California. Desperate enough to hire anyone who knows horses and won't steal him blind, Elena felt hope beginning to bloom in her chest. It wasn't California, but it was a chance, perhaps the only chance they would get. "We know horses," she said firmly. "Both of us." Peterson nodded and remounted his horse. "Tell Williams that Marshal Peterson sent you. He'll give you a fair shake." He paused, looking down at them with something that might have been sympathy. "Word of advice, keep moving during daylight hours and don't camp near any towns. There's still plenty of folks around here who don't take kindly to unconventional marriages." As the three riders prepared to leave, Eleanor felt compelled to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Marshal, will it ever get easier? Will people ever accept us?" Peterson considered her question seriously. "I don't know, Mrs. Nalnish. The world's changing, but it's changing slow. Best you can do is prove them wrong one day at a time." After the riders disappeared over a ridge, Elena and Nalnish stood in silence for several minutes, processing what had just happened. They had come so close to disaster, yet somehow emerged with hope. 50 miles to this ranch," Nalnish said finally. "We can make it," Elena replied, surprised by her own confidence. "We've made it this far." As they broke camp and prepared for another day's journey, Elena found herself thinking about the carved eagle now tucked safely in her saddlebag. Maybe Nalnish's grandmother had been right about finding one's true path. Maybe theirs led not to California, but to a horse ranch where they could prove that love and determination were stronger than prejudice and fear. The desert stretched before them, vast and challenging as always. But for the first time since leaving San Rafael, Elena felt like they were traveling towards something instead of away from it.